the Spec Network. This is Fragmented, an Android developer podcast where we talk about building good software and becoming better Android developers. I'm DonnFelker.
And I'm KaushikGopal.
Welcome to the show.
You know what sucks? Waiting. Life is just too short to be waiting and waiting. If you're an Android developer and you need to run lint checks, unit tests, UI tests, check to see that the build doesn't fail because of a commit that you made, after every single commit, just think about it. You could run it on your local and then wait. But as we have established, waiting sucks. Well, Microsoft has a service called AppCenter that they'd like to promote and help us in this waiting problem. The whole point of using AppCenter is to automate my Android development lifecycle. So what does this mean? That means every time I commit my code to GitHub, I can just power on with my next feature, go live my life, breaking things occasionally. And AppCenter will make sure that I, don't go too crazy. In the background, it pulls the code from GitHub, runs the Gradle build, runs my unit tests, runs the UI tests, does this all without having to make me wait on my local machine. But AppCenter does more though. It's a fully modular suite of services, so you can pick and choose the service that you need and you can connect it to the tools that you already use. They have crash reporting, analytics, push services, a test device lab of their own, and you can selectively pick just the ones that you want. I particularly like the test device lab. They have some of the most common Android devices that you'll find in the market. So, the Samsung devices that we all know are pretty prevalent and need to test our apps on, but don't like to own personally. Well, they have the Samsung devices up there. It's exactly what you would expect. They run screenshots on every test. It's amazing. If you're looking for a CI service, I highly, highly recommend them. You'll get a host of other services to boot along with it. And the best way to do it is to just try. Head on over to appcenter.ms. My thanks again to Microsoft and to AppCenter for sponsoring today's show.
In this episode, we continue with part 2 of this GraphQL series. If you haven't listened to episode 125 already, it probably might make sense to first listen to that one. This was the previous episode. In that one, we go into the basics of GraphQL, why you would need something like GraphQL. It's pretty good to set the foundation. But in this episode, we dive into the specifics of the implementation for GraphQL in Android. Mike created Apollo, a library that's open source that essentially is the de facto implementation for GraphQL on Android. So in this episode, we dive deep into the specifics of Apollo, how Mike went about creating GraphQL, what were some of the thoughts around how he went about creating this library, and how he could spend some time making this pretty Android specific. So without further ado, part 2.
So we have, our server team has provided all the graph data, the schema, everything we just talked about on that homepage. We can go explore, etc. We can work with that or understand that and see what we can work with and query for. But now on the Android side, if I want to actually make a request, let's say I'm writing an Android client for GitHub right now, and I've looked at the GitHub Explorer, and I want to actually start communicating with that GraphQL endpoint. Do I have to do this all manually with OKHTTP, setting all of the body parameters myself and kind of managing this myself? Or is there an Android library or libraries out there that can help me do this?
A year ago, I would have told you that you have to do it all yourself. And that's what I started doing myself when I was tasked with writing a GraphQL client at the New York Times. And it was really hard. I mean, it's a huge spec. It's a standard. There's a lot of concepts in it. And it felt really overwhelming, particularly in a statically typed language where it's a little difficult to work with dynamic data.
I forgot about that, yeah.
New York Times was really committed to open source. My team loved open source. We had a few open source libraries at this point that were pretty successful, which got us buy-in from our bosses to implement a GraphQL client completely open source from the get-go. There was never an internal implementation of an Android GraphQL client at the New York Times. What we did instead was, first I searched for open source. Does anything exist? There was nothing. There were some Java clients, but they just weren't robust enough for me and not Android-y enough for me. Where I started reaching out, everywhere, on Twitter, on Slacks with other Android engineers. And finally, someone replied to me, Felipe Lima from Airbnb, who at the time was also exploring GraphQL. And he started talking to a company, Apollo, which already had a JavaScript and iOS open source implementation. But they didn't really know Android. None of them were Android devs, and they were looking for people from the community to get GraphQL onto Android, and they offered us support to make that happen. So after countless meetings and design sessions, we started coming up with a client that will not only fulfill the GraphQL spec, but feel really Androidy, feel familiar to Android developers from the get-go.
Wow, that's amazing. Okay.
Yeah, so I didn't want to reinvent the wheel, so we took concepts from how SQLite code generates SQL data from queries to the database. We leveraged OKHTP as both something upstream from us and as a style for writing our APIs. And through everything, we really wanted to keep performance in mind and make something that wasn't going to use a lot of reflection, or any reflection, actually. It wasn't going to blow through your memory. It'll do things in a streaming manner, and it will stay type safe the way that both Java and GraphQL are. So we, after I'd say about 6 months of development, had a client that was stable enough for us to start using. It's called Apollo Android, and it is now a full-fledged GraphQL client.
Wow! Congratulations.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, it was an effort. Honestly, I did a lot more architecting and just answering questions. A few Shopify developers did most of the work. There were a few people from Airbnb that contributed some of the caching implementations for it. And we try to keep things, so Apollo exists in other languages, so we try to standardize at least our names, where our cache would be called an Apollo store, just like it is in JavaScript and in iOS, but we built everything very, very Androidy. So for example, the Android client can be exposed with RxJava as the interface that you use. We wrote bindings for Espresso so that we'll actually have idling resources so that you can test any of this code. So the way that Apollo works is that you drop a query, the same query that you can write in the GitHub Explorer, into your project, into a GraphQL directory. You run our Gradle plugin, and then we will generate for you request objects, response objects, and reflection-free parsers. Because this isn't really parsing JSON. This is parsing and rearranging GraphQL data. And this is where I really started having trouble when I was trying to do this myself. There's rules to how you read this data and how fragments get exploded back out when you go into Java models. And the Apollo client does all of this for you. And we do this with a runtime client that is modeled a lot after the API that OKHTP has, where you create a call object, you pass it a request, in our case a query or a mutation, and then you execute that call, which will then return to you a response.
Oh, so that's what you meant when you modeled it after OKHTP. It was like the implementation of how the request and response sort of gets executed.
Yep, exactly. In ways that, how Glide kind of borrowed from Picasso's API, because we're all Android developers and we were used to that API. Mm-hmm. We try to do the same thing with OKHTP.
So it was written in Java, I presume. So I can still use it with Kotlin, right? Like, do the APIs necessarily get better if I use it with Kotlin, or does that naturally just come with Kotlin? There wasn't necessarily anything specific that you had to do.
Sure. The code generation is actually written in Kotlin. It was written in Kotlin before Android team started officially supporting Kotlin.
Oh, wow.
The runtime generates Java data classes, immutable. They're the same as auto value classes, just we don't use auto value, but it's that same value objects to the effective Java spec. Mm-hmm. You can use them with Kotlin. We are considering rewriting the runtime in Kotlin, but because only there's 35% of support in Kotlin and Android or of use right now, we kept the runtime in Java, but the bytecode will look just like data classes do in Kotlin. Yeah, I've only used it in Kotlin. I've only interfaced with it in Kotlin, and it works beautifully.
I guess my other question is, so there are a couple of, if I pull in Apollo, right, it does bring in a bunch of other dependencies. And most of these dependencies for most modern Android developers today probably already exist, but I guess it's worthy to call that out, right?
Right now, the only hard dependency is on OKHTTP. All other dependencies are optional, like RxJava.
Oh, nice. So they're just like extensions on top of Apollo, I presume.
That's right. There's also Android. There's an Android package as well that you can add that adds things like handlers and getting your result on the main thread. Technically, Apollo Android can work in any Java project. It does not have to be an Android project. We kept things like SQLite, whatever the Android implementation is, within an Android support package.
Oh, nice.
I'm looking at the documentation here, and it's definitely interesting that you can just generate, your objects and so forth, and you have, everything is strongly typed. So that's fantastic. Now, if someone who's coming from, let's say, retrofit, and they would like to start migrating over, they have a GraphQL endpoint they want to start using. They still have REST in their application because, we have applications that have been around for a while. Is there a good way to start? I guess what I'm saying is a good way to migrate from a REST endpoint over to GraphQL. Is there any tips that you could provide in that migration process?
Or how you went about it at New York Times too, right? Because I imagine that was a similar process. You didn't just flip it overnight and said, okay, let there be GraphQL,
Yep. So for a while, we were doing both. We had both the REST and the GraphQL side of it. We had view models, so it was easier for us to change the domain layer or the network layer from REST to GraphQL, and then start writing mappers from that back to our view models.
Okay.
At the end of the day, just start using it a little bit, see how you like it, see if it fulfills your requests. We noticed when we started using GraphQL, we could actually drop a lot of other things as well. There is caching within Apollo, so you don't really need your own database.
Oh.
And if it more started feeling as a full data solution, all you really need to do is write your UI layer and then connect that to Apollo.
Oh, I didn't quite catch that. So the caching that exists is almost like a permanent cache that exists. So does it survive app kills, obviously rotations and like the standard stuff. So it is a cache that's stored on disk in the app, I presume.
It's entirely up to you. There's an HTTP cache implementation that will store responses on disk, just as raw responses. And then there's two normalized caches. The normalized caches will cache individual nodes separately, and that allows you to share within your cache. Different queries can actually reuse the same cache, even though it was from different requests. That cache, there is a memory implementation and a SQLite implementation, but all of this is interface-based that you can implement your own normalized or HTTP cache.
Got it. That actually makes a lot more sense. And I understand why you mentioned with the implementation about exploring the fragments and reusing. I imagine in order to enable a lot of this is why you talked about that, right?
That's right. So if you have something like master detail flows, you can load the same data from your master query when you're getting your detail query.
Oh, okay.
Nice. That's nice. A couple of quick follow-up questions to what you said. So you said having the view models made it really easy because then you can just probably swap out the data layer, or if folks use a repository kind of pattern, which is probably in your view model that's driving the data. This is an example of why it's really it's beneficial to have that kind of an architecture where you've separated each of those layers, because what I'm hearing for you, the migration went pretty straightforward because you could let's take an example. Say maybe you had a repository of just news items, right? That returned an observable of news items. You could still keep the API from the repository to be an observable of news items. So your activity code, your view model code, none of that changes, but you could just drive it from a different repository, say GraphQL repository versus, a REST repository or whatever you were using before. So was it as simple as just swapping out there because the data objects remain the same?
That's exactly it. And we had a library that we open sourced called Store, and that actually was our repository. And you're absolutely right. We went from our homepage repository to our homepage GraphQL repository, exposed them both to return the same view models, and our UI was never the wiser that that this was now a GraphQL backed app rather than a REST backed app.
And that, folks, is why you should be using a similar pattern.
We were a little opinionated in Apollo. We actually don't let you implement parcelable within our data models because we want to encourage you to make view models rather than passing your your network and database models from activity to activity.
Oh, interesting. So you do almost enforce the repository being like requeried, so to speak, in each activity, which makes sense, I guess.
Yep, that's right.
I guess would that go to the same for, I can't use those same objects for something like Room or anything like that too?
Currently, no. The logic to create the data models, particularly because you need to create each of the inner models before you can create the outer models, made it very difficult for us to make this interface based rather than implementation based.
Gotcha.
So the current recommendation is to use your own models for Room or to just use our database. It's a public project. If there's something that we're not doing that you want, we can add those implementations for you into our data layer.
Okay. So just dwelling, because we brought up the topic of Room, I guess like now what I'm trying to understand is how would Room play into this? Is Room, I guess the two don't necessarily have to deal with each other, right? Like these, I'm trying to understand. Because right now, say I have an existing repository with Room and I have like certain, my models, like which are like data classes or whatever, my class is my Room models, right? So you're saying I can't use the exact same classes in GraphQL. They would have to be GraphQL specific classes that represent my models from the data layer, right?
They would. And those are the models that we auto-generate for you. But unfortunately, this does mean while you're migrating, you may have a larger method count since you may be duplicating some of your models.
Got it.
I'd say that was the biggest drawback of our implementation. But we feel pretty strongly that you should not be reusing your network models. And it also just leads to a better developer experience where within 10 minutes of downloading Apollo, you can run a query and see your results and without having to implement all the models yourself.
Got it. So the network models is the part where they would have to be different. But if you architect this in a way where the network models are not obviously exposed directly through the view model, but you have a representation of just the data on your screen, which is a different model, then that would work because those can plug into either a version of the network model. Is that an accurate summary of like my understanding?
Yep. So when this is used in other languages like JavaScript, it's really made in a way where the UI elements are subscribing directly to the queries, and all they're doing is rendering whatever it is. So that's one way that you can use Apollo where you don't need anything else. Apollo will be all of your data operations, all your data models, and will be tightly coupled to whatever UI you have. The other way to use it is use it as just your domain layer, just for talking to the network, and then transforming them to whatever view models or database models that your app is using if you have a more robust application. So we try to hit both of those use cases. The at-home developer that is wanting to spiral up apps as quickly as possible, and the enterprise developer that really wasn't or shouldn't have been sharing models throughout their application anyway.
That makes sense. It caters to two different sort of use cases.
Yeah, so it seems like we have a lot of different things we have to consider when migrating over to something like Apollo. Is there any kind of heuristics or rules of thumb of like, hey, this is a you should move over to Apollo GraphQL, or you shouldn't, or what would you advise someone who's thinking about it?
If I was an independent developer that controlled my own backend, this might not be the most useful thing for you.
Okay.
You're already writing your RESTful APIs in a manner where they fulfill exactly what data you need. If you're a startup or somewhere smaller where you're sitting right next to the backend gal or guy, you may just be able to ask them, hey, expose this additional field or do whatever specification you're going to give them. This works better for things that are very dynamic or things that are evolving or scaling and becoming huge, where it takes longer to fulfill requests or takes longer to make changes just because there's more things involved with each change.
Yeah, makes sense.
Another drawback that you mentioned is obviously like the method count, because of the additional code generation is sort of something to consider, right? Were there any other disadvantages or drawbacks that you noticed, specifically viewing this from the lens of an Android developer?
I don't think so. I've been really picky about making this super Androidy. Everything is a streaming API through it. I've tested it fetching a 20 megabyte GraphQL response. I've tested it with 21 megabyte responses all going at the same time. And it really fulfilled. I had very strict requirements of what I would want this to be. And someone from Shopify or a few developers have really, I've been really taken through the ringer with all of my changes and all of the requests of, hey, can we speed this up, or can we optimize this so it'll work like other libraries? Mm-hmm. It's in a really good place. It's something that I'm really proud of. It's something that I feel is the culmination of all of my Android knowledge and all of my open source work to throw it all into a single library and have this as a solution for a problem that didn't seem to have a solution at the time.
Very nice. Have you seen other people sort of adopt some of this? Like, I'm curious about that experience now. Have other people actually like adopted it? Are there like other sort of places that have picked up on GraphQL, specifically in the Android world and like being used in this case?
I'm sure. And I actually just got back from I/O as well, and it was startling. Developers were coming up to me and telling me how much they love Apollo and how they've been using it. And someone from Microsoft came up to me that they're exploring it and something that they want to use. And that's
awesome.
That's great.
It feels great of like developers of all sizes. And this is the first thing I've ever really been involved with that people besides me have been writing articles online about it. Like, you can search for Apollo Android and there's Medium posts about it. There's sample projects that developers I've never met have been making. And it feels really good to get the ball rolling on GraphQL on Android. Now, whether this is the best solution and will continue to be the best solution, I don't know, but it's something that I feel like has gotten a little bit of momentum, and we've been able to write many tests around all the use cases that we've seen, and feel like if someone needs to start GraphQL, they're going to be able to start it with this.
Very cool.
A quick follow-up to like one of the disadvantages. You did mention there's code generation. I imagine how did you folks notice like a difference in your build times per se?
Yeah. So build time suffers. So to give a little more detail on that, there's a Node.js code gen implementation of GraphQL that makes an intermediate representation of your queries and the schema. We use this, and our Gradle plugin actually uses a Gradle Node plugin to run this code gen.
Oh.
So unfortunately, this means one, you need to have Node.js installed on your machine. We can install it for you if you don't the first time, but there is that cost of running the Node.js code gen and then running our code gen as a second layer before you have your models. We're getting better with it. We're starting to look into some of the incremental APIs and how to clean ourselves up better and dirty flags so that we're not going to do more work than we need to.
I guess at this point we should maybe talk about like some of the resources. If I wanted to pick up on Apollo or like understand how to go about this, what are some good resources that you can mention? I do know you gave a talk at DroidCon NYC, I think 2017, right?
Yes, sir. Yep.
Yeah, so we'll definitely add a link to that in the show notes because that was a really good talk. Anything else that you want to point us to that you think would be a good starting point?
So this is why I'm actually really excited that I'm on this podcast. We're all pretty good devs that are involved with this process, but no one's really good at documenting anything. So
that's true.
We have a bunch of tests within the project. We have a README, and the project is really well commented through JavaDoc. But unfortunately, that's where our story ends right now of public outreach or getting out how any of this works. So I really want to actually reach out to the community. If anyone loves writing documentation or figuring out APIs, it would be huge for us to start having documentation that is as robust as the JavaScript implementation or the iOS implementation. So Apollo is actually an organization, and they will host our docs and make sure that everything is up to date, but it's still new enough that we don't really have good sources besides our README to point people to. Oh, and we also have a Slack channel. That's the other thing. On the GitHub repo, you'll see a Slack channel. I'm in there all day. If you have any questions, come in and talk Android or GraphQL.
I want to interject here and add to what Mike said about writing documentation. There's a lot of folks that reach out to me every week about, hey, how do I, grow my career as a developer? How do I, kind of get seen more? How do I get more involved? Writing documentation is one of the easiest ways that you can contribute back to the community. It's so simple to get going and it's valued so heavily. So if you're looking for a way to provide value and become more active in the community, this is a perfect opportunity. Don't sleep on this chance. Someone's going to take it. Hop in there and help out if you can.
Absolutely. Documentation, even like some testing, like for in general for like Android repositories, this is the easiest and probably one of the most beneficial ways to contribute to like open source projects. It's just an easy way to give back, right?
Yeah. And a lot of times I think people are afraid of like, well, if I write the documentation, then what if it's wrong? And then they're going to tell me it's wrong. Well, what's going to happen is you're probably going to put up a PR. You're going to make whatever notes you're going to make about the docs. And if something's incorrect, of course, the team is going to say, hey, this is incorrect. This is actually how it should be. That's a multiple win there because you're providing back to the community, you're helping the team, they see you're helping, you're then learning more about it, you can correct it and then also become a contributing member at the end of the day.
100%. And if you ever have doubts, you can just reach out to one of like the maintainers. And now because you've set up this channel between the two, it just, it accelerates your learning. So, if you write documentation for Apollo, then Mike will probably just, you can reach out to Mike and he'll give you the lowdown, right?
That's right. Absolutely.
Is there anything else that you like wanted to maybe talk to us about before we start to wind this down?
Sure. So I want to touch on one more point, and it's about something that I think was a little bit awkward that happened to our project. And this was the first time something like this has ever happened to me. So I've always been involved with open source, and the way that I've been involved with open source is contributing to other projects, asking them questions, but I always knew that, when things are publicly licensed, anyone can take the work and use it for whatever they want. Mm-hmm. And a couple of months ago, I was contacted. I was actually sitting at work, and one of my buddies was at Amazon's big conference. And as part of their keynote, they introduced a GraphQL implementation they called AppSync. And they introduced this as a way to have GraphQL on AWS. And I was really excited about this. We can compare notes and see what they did, how they did differently from us. And immediately I was able to go to their GitHub repo. Mm-hmm. And lo and behold, what I saw was Apollo Android and other Apollo code. That was a really awkward moment for me that it wasn't something that was forked. It was actually something that the source code was just downloaded and then reposted as Amazon's work. And I mean, it's okay to, use other people's work. I get it. We all do it. But what we've started seeing is that there's Amazon AppSync customers now that are coming to our Slack, to our public Slack, asking us questions because, they still see my name in the comments or see that the README is the same on Apollo as it is on Amazon's side. So yeah, that was my first wow kind of moments in open source where I thoroughly was surprised that a company as large as Amazon would take open source work and just commit it as their own. And I guess at some point they might have put some attribution up. But if anyone's listening that is involved with it on the Amazon side, we'd love to work with you and would love to have you be part of our community and do it in a way where you're not maintaining our code with the comments that I wrote as though it is your own.
To be clear, I don't think, because it's completely open source, Apollo is open source, they aren't necessarily violating anything, just to be clear.
That's right. Yeah, there was no license violations, just that.
It is a little awkward because if you want to be more friendly in the open source community, forking and then using it makes more sense.
Yeah, so that's the only kind of uncomfortableness that we had with this project. But other than that, everything is just puppies and rainbows.
If anything, it's validation, right? I think that it points towards if it was chosen by a company as big as Amazon, then hey, this library is pretty damn good then.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And, my concern is just more stuff of it's a fork. So a lot of the changes that we've made the last 6 months have not made it into their implementation.
Right. And
I'm hoping that we find a way to all work together.
Cool. All right. Mike, this has been really amazing. Thank you so much for talking to us about Apollo, giving us the information on GraphQL. I imagine listeners are now extremely excited and interested about this, and they probably want to hit you up and ask more questions and find out more. What would be a good way to do that?
Either on Twitter, Friendly Mikhail, or through our Apollo GraphQL Slack in the Android channel.
Nice. And we'll make sure to add links in the show notes to both of those. Don, if folks want to find out what's up with your GraphQL investigations, what is a good way to do that?
They can reach out to me on Twitter at DonnFelker or Instagram on the same handle. And what about you, Kaushik? How do they get a hold of you?
I am Kaushik Gopal on Twitter and on Instagram and most other channels. So thank you all so much for listening. Again, Mike, thank you so much for coming on the show. This was a lot of fun for us. I'm sure our listeners are going to enjoy this episode a lot. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you, Mike.
Awesome. I was so happy to be here. Thank you so much.
All right, folks, we will catch you in the next episode. Before we wind the show down, I want to take a quick moment and thank Microsoft again for sponsoring today's show. They want to promote App Center. App Center is a continuous integration, delivery, and feedback service for your Android apps. You should check them out if you're looking for a CI solution or a UI testing solution. Head on over to appcenter.ms and spend less time managing your app lifecycle and more time coding. Because in the end, that's what makes us all happy. Thanks again for sponsoring today's show, Microsoft. That's it for the show, folks. Fragmented is hosted by DonnFelker and me, Kaushik Gopal. We edit and produce all the episodes here on Fragmented. Sarah the Amazing Jackson from the Spec Network helps with production assistance and wraps our final mix. Our theme and ad music is by the national recording artist Blueprint from Weightless Recordings. You can find more Fragmented episodes at fragmentedpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we will catch you in the next episode.